Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're with us this morning. We're going to be on session number 5 in your quarterly, and the title of it is called Includes. You know, Jesus extends mercy to all people, not just a set group as he did in the Bible for a while with the Israelites and the Jews, but he includes it to all people, and that was his plan from the very beginning, that all people could and would be saved if they came to Jesus. Most of us have at least experienced being excluded from something. Would it be chosen for a game, that softball game or something that kids were playing at school or something? We've been excluded somehow or another. And sometimes this can be emotionally painful for us. It takes a while to get over that. But the opposite can also be being included in a group or event can be a life-giving change in your life. In the same way, the memory of belonging can remain with us throughout our life. So let's go in a little bit into understanding the context today, and that's going to be taken from Mark chapter 7, verse 1 through 8, and then chapter 21. We can see once again Jesus had conflicts with the Jewish religious leaders. And the issue was ceremonial uncleanliness, with the Pharisees and scribes criticizing Jesus for the behavior of his disciples. But we can see that Jesus addressed the issue as one of elevating human traditions and teachings over the Word of God. Now, the hypocrites of these religious leaders, it was driven by the reality that their hearts were far from the Lord and his revealed will. Jesus condemned their self-serving traditions, such as using religious devotion to exempt themselves from caring for their parents. The encounter with the Pharisees prompted Jesus to address the crowds and to assert that the external emphasis of the religious leaders did not address the origin of spiritual contamination. He advised them to focus their attention on the heart from which all behavior flows. The disciples kind of demonstrated spiritual obscureness at this teaching, and Jesus gently rebuked their lack of understanding. Now, expanding on this message to the crowds, the Lord enumerated all types of sinful behavior as ultimately a spiritual malfunction of the heart. So much of the vice list mentioned by Jesus represented violations of the Ten Commandments. Now, if you think about it, that's where a lot of sin comes in, is by not following the Ten Commandments. The disciples' spiritual dullness showed up again at Jesus' feeding of the 4,000, a repeat of a previous miracle. If you look at Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 43, we see the Pharisees approached Jesus again and demanded a sign for him. Now, he just fed 4,000 people with a few fish and loaves of bread. That should have been sign enough for these folks. But he refused to accommodate them. As Jesus traveled to Bethsaida by boat, he warned them about the insidious influences of the Pharisees. No doubt this evil influence consisted of their invalidation of Scripture by their elevation of human traditions. The disciples once again misunderstood his reference to leaven, thinking he was thinking about literally bread. In reality, he was talking about the Pharisees and scribes and their sins. And this kind of demonstrated their own failure to remember Jesus' mighty works. Let's go on into the lesson today. And the first part of the lesson is going to be talking about dejected. And it's going to be taken from chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. He got up and departed from there to the region of Tyre. Now, and the reason he did this, he was trying to escape the crowds. But even at that, Jesus really could not escape the crowds, because news of his miracles and the things that he'd done had reached far and wide. But we can see that he departed to that region and entered a house. I did not want anyone to know it, but he could not escape to notice. See, he just didn't want anybody to know where he was at. And at times, I think the reason for this is Jesus sought to get off the grid and remain incognito. But he just could not escape notice, perhaps due to his previous exposure to its citizens while nearby Galilee. We just don't know. See, people who have needs, especially regarding their children, will passionately seek help to alleviate the situation. Now, he entered the house and did not want anyone to know it, but he could not escape notice. Instead, immediately after hearing about him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Gentile, and she was asking him to cast a demon out of her daughter. Now, we can see that as soon as Jesus entered this house, there was a woman who came whose little daughter had an unclean spirit. She had come and fell at his feet and asking him to heal her daughter. No doubt she was in desperate need of help at this time. Now, Mark describes the woman as a Gentile. Jesus had been ministering in a region dominated by Jews. Now, a Gentile woman sought his help. Let's look at verses 27 to 28 and see what happens. He said to her, "Let your children be fed first, because it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." "But," she replied to him, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And we can see that there is no dancing around the fact that Jesus used a prevalent term for Gentiles, which was dogs. Now, a lot of people may be thinking, well, why did Jesus call them dogs? Even though he did that, it doesn't deny his compassionate nature, nor affirm any prejudice on his part. You see, the particular word used in the text for dog was a diminutive form that could be translated as puppies. Now, perhaps the key word in understanding the heart of Jesus here is the word first. His ministry was directed toward the Jewish people. That was first. Now, the Apostle Paul later followed the same pattern of Jesus in Romans chapter 1, verse 16. So eventually the mission of the gospel will be directed toward all people groups, and that's in Mark 13:10. Now note that the women did not correct Jesus. She accepted what he said. She merely pointed out that the priority expressed by Jesus didn't exclude the blessings for the Gentiles. Now, what is commendable about her is that she saw a possible expansion of the very work that Jesus had come to perform. And by referring to Jesus as Lord, it demonstrated her faith in him. And Matthew's account of this interaction affirms that. Let's look at verses 29 through 30 now. Then he told her, "Because of this reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." When she went back to her home, she found her child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. Now, Jesus told the woman, "Because of what you have said, you can return home. Your daughter was healed." Though not Jewish, this woman lived in an area that it was adjacent to Israel. She lived in what is now known as Syria. She could have known that she had no basis for approaching a rabbi such as Jesus. In that days, you didn't approach somebody like Jesus unless you was a Jew. Yet she did anyway. Hers is not an example of assertion of rights and privileges. Rather, it is an example of someone coming to Jesus based on worthiness, not on worthiness, but on need. We see here in a combination of both boldness and humility. Now, this is what the gospel does. It humbles us in our unfitness, but exalts us in the love we receive from the Father. Now, the placement of this account of Jesus' healing of the woman's daughter was not accidental on the part of Mark. he follows the declaration by Jesus that all foods were spiritually clean. Now that's in Mark 7, verses 19. The point of this passage is that not only are all foods clean, but so are all groups of people. And we offer the hope of the gospel to every person, including social outcasts. Now let's look on to verses 30, 31 now. Again, leaving the region of Tyre, he went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, through the region of Decapolis. See, the route Jesus took after leaving the region of Sidon was somewhat meandering. Since the Lord's purpose was to avoid the crowds, his path may have been a strategic move to allow him to spend time with his disciples. As had been the case and would continue to be so, their understanding of his mission remained cloudy. See, he was still teaching his disciples at this point. Now, we should consider the purpose of Mark in showing Jesus traveling through the non-Jewish areas. So, because Decapolis means 10 cities, and may have represented a stronghold of Greek influence and culture. Every faith community contends with the human tendency to become inwardly focused and exclusive. That means not letting outsiders in. This portrayal of Jesus forging in places that Judaism considered off limits is corrective against that tendency. His example leads us toward becoming appropriately inexclusive as God would desire. God doesn't want us to leave anybody out. He wants us to bring everybody in. He wants us to minister to everybody. Let's look at verse 32 and 33 now. They brought to him a deaf man who had difficulty speaking and begged Jesus to lay his hands on him. So he took him away from the crowd in private. After putting his fingers in the man's ears and spitting, he touched his tongue. So we can see that evidently the people in the area had noticed Jesus' presence. And they brought to him a deaf man who had difficulty speaking. Perhaps his reputation as a miracle worker has spread throughout the area because of the testimony of the man from Gadara, whom Jesus had restored. In any case, they begged Jesus to lay his hands on him. See, physical touch had become a part of several previous healings by the Lord. And in some cases, those healed had probably not been touched by another human being in a long time. So Jesus took the deaf man away from the crowd to a private place. He had no interest in putting on a show for the crowd. Publicity and fanfare made no substantial contribution to his ultimate mission of dying for the sins of the world. It may have been that Jesus' personal concern for the deaf man prompted his removal from the crowd. We don't know. For his entire lifetime, this man had probably been made a spectacle. It was not inconceivable that Jesus' actions stemmed from his sensitivity to this man's painful experiences. He provided individual cure to a man with physical challenges. We can see at this point that Jesus touched a man's ears and his tongue. Now, these areas represented his deafness and muteness and symbolized the opening of his ears and the loosening of his tongue. These actions were enumerated in Isaiah, who prophesied that the Messiah would unstop deaf ears and cause the mute to sing for joy. And that's Isaiah chapter 35, verses 5 through 6. So we can see that everything Jesus did was a fulfilling of the prophecies of the Old Testament. Everything he done. Let's look at verses 34 through 35 now. Looking up to heaven, he sighed deeply and said to him, and it's such a long, hard word, I'm not going to say that. You can read it in your manual. But it means be opened. Immediately his ears were opened and his tongue was loosened and he began to speak clearly. See, Jesus lifted up his eyes and sighed deeply. Now these two actions represent keen realities about what was about to take place. First, in looking heavenly, Jesus demonstrated his reliance on the power of God working through him. Secondly, the sight revealed that the underlying spiritual fight behind every miracle of healing. In doing battle with the power of evil, Jesus sought divine aid in the conflict. Folks, we need divine aid in the conflict today against evil. We need to pray and always look heavenly. And speaking the words, Jesus commanded the man's ears to be opened, and immediately both the afflictions under which this man suffered were healed. First his ears and then his tongue. You know, the sadness of human personality is evident in that God created man in his own image, and in that Christ died for man. Therefore, every person of every race possesses full dignity and is worthy of respect and Christian love. And that's the sacredness of the human personality. Let's carry on now in chapter 7, verse 36 through 37. He ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more they proclaimed it. They were extremely astonished and said, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." Now, after performing such a great miracle of healing and restoration before the gathering crowd, Jesus did a strange thing and ordered them to tell no one. You know, this is contrary to everything that we humans do, because we have this tendency to talk about amazing events and to command the Lord to share the gospel with all people. We have that. But he told this group of people to tell no one. See, all the things the crowds were wowed about by giving sight to the blind, opening ears of the deaf, loosening tongues of the mute, releasing the afflicted, casting out evil spirits, and raising the dead, were but pointers to what was to come. The death and resurrection of Jesus. That was what was coming. It all these point to that. And since at this point that still lay in the future, the signs and wonders performed by Jesus couldn't truly be understood by them at this time. They didn't really get it. And sometimes today I don't think we really get what the signs and miracles were pointing to. You know, sometimes we get the cart before the horse ourselves. We focus on the benefits of a relationship with Christ to enlist others in the Christian experience without always fully appreciating the basis for those blessings. Like the crowds of people with whom he dealt, we err in seeing Jesus only as means to an end rather than to an end to all the things. See, in a similar way, we sometimes try to use Jesus for our own agendas rather than submitting to his. These challenges for believers is to maintain the tension between the blessings of the Lord that the Lord gives us because of his salvation and the salvation itself, between what they are and what it costs Jesus to provide them for us. Yes, we should remember with joy and cherish all the benefits he has provided for us in redemption, but not at the expense of focusing on his mission of saving all those who believe in him. The more he ordered them to tell no one, the more jealous they were in proclaiming it. Even though he had just opened the ears of a deaf man, Jesus' direct command was not heard by the crowd. Sometimes it seems that whatever the Lord tells us to do, we do the exact opposite. And that's the reason we have, it's hard for us That's one of the challenges for us as believers, is we have this tension between the blessing the Lord gives us because of His salvation and His salvation itself. Verse 37, it says, the crowds were extremely astonished. The works they saw Jesus perform were way beyond expectations. And the expression, He has done everything well. Got to remember, this was a predominantly Gentile audience that echoed these words. And these were the words that found in Genesis 1, chapter 1, verses 31. And the affirmation that all of God's work is good. Even these Gentiles, the pagan multitudes, recognized the benevolence activity of God in His Son, Jesus Christ. What was truly astonishing, however, was that the work of renewal promised by Isaiah chapter 35 occurred outside the geographical boundaries of the nation of Israel. So I think this was a sign also that the Gentiles were going to be included in the salvation, in God's salvation, and God's grace. See, and it's a shame that we do err in seeing Jesus only as a means to an end rather than as the end of all things. You know, as believers, we should offer the hope of Jesus to social outcasts, to everyone. Just because we're Christians don't mean that we have an inclusive club. We should include everybody. And as believers, we must show individual care to people with physical challenges. I know I have a physical challenge speaking. Some words I just cannot pronounce. And I'm challenged with them. And you'll notice as we go through the lessons that sometimes I'll skip hard words and replace them with something I can say. So forgive me for that. Believers must remain focused on the redemption provided to all through Jesus alone. Let's not lose our focus, folks. As believers, this is what we should be teaching the outcast about the redemption Jesus Christ offers to everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed the lesson today. I'm happy to be back. I know I've been gone quite a bit and quite a lot lately, but vacationing and doing things and getting out more. But God bless you all. Have a great day, and hopefully, if God willing, we'll see each other next Wednesday.